I am Joao, a free man, but I carry invisible chains that no one else sees. When freedom finally came, I thought it would be my salvation. The promise of a better future without the shadow of shackles seemed possible. Colonel Luis came into my life as a helping hand, saying he would give me a chance to start over. "Here you'll work with dignity, earn what you deserve," he told me, and I, a man marked by the pain of the past, believed him. I thought I had found a new path. But how could I have been so naive? What I didn't know is that true slavery isn't made of iron, but of lies that imprison us in the soul. What I thought was a favor turned into a trap. Now, I need to tell my story so that no one else falls into the same trap I did. When Colonel Luis came into my life, I didn't know what to expect. I had seen many men in my journey, but none looked at me the way he did. He wasn't like the others. He didn't seem like someone who would see me as just another tool for work or a burden. On the contrary, he spoke to me as if I were a friend. He was firm, but his words carried a softness, as though his only mission was to help me start a new life. In that moment, I believed him. He told me he knew what I had been through, that he understood the pains of a man who grew up under the weight of chains, but now I would be free, and he, the colonel, would be the bridge between my past and my future. He spoke about what I could achieve if I worked for him, promising a fair wage, a dignified home, and a life without fear. The colonel made me believe that freedom wasn't something earned only by the abolition of slavery, but something built every day with honest work and good intentions. I felt lost, unsure of where to step. Freedom seemed like a concept too distant, something so grand I could hardly touch it. And even though I had my eyes wide open to the world before me, I felt that I was more prepared to face the truth with someone by my side. That's why I accepted his offer. I would work for him indefinitely in exchange for a better future, a place where I wouldn't just be another face among the thousands of former slaves trying to rebuild their lives. The colonel seemed to understand what I needed, and that's what convinced me the most. When the first day of work came, I found myself in a vast field, with bare land stretching to infinity, a place as big as the hope I had of finally being someone. The colonel placed me in a group of men, all former slaves like me, and at first the camaraderie was calm. They looked at me with sympathy as if, in that moment, we were all equally desperate for a chance. We worked together, digging, planting, and cultivating. They all seemed to know what they were doing, while I, in truth, was more lost than ever. But the colonel never let me feel that uncertainty. He was always there, watching, guiding, offering words of encouragement. The day-to-day felt slow, but there was something about that place, something that made me believe I was taking the right steps. I believed I was starting a new life, far from fear and hunger. The colonel became the figure I felt I needed to follow, someone who truly wanted what was best for me, someone who would give me something real. He spoke to me about how life should be made of hard work, but that this effort would be rewarded, that I would see the fruits of my labor. In the first few months, I gave my all. I didn't mind working harder than the others because I believed that it would reflect the promise the colonel had made me. I wanted to show him that I was grateful for giving me a chance, for taking me out of uncertainty and giving me something tangible to fight for. It was the promise of a future, of a place no longer dominated by pain and lack. But the truth was, over the months, something began to bother me. It wasn't the words he said, but what he didn't say. He began disappearing from his farm for days, leaving others in charge of the management. And whenever he returned, he would bring up new plans, new goals for the farm, as if he were always one step ahead. I, who believed he was committed to my happiness, didn't realize that he was only trying to gain more control over the rest of us, keeping us always in an inferior position. Still, the promise of a better future kept me strong. I kept telling myself the reward would come in time, that it was just a matter of waiting. I still believed he was doing what was right. As the months passed, I began to notice something strange, though vaguely and confusedly. The work never decreased, and the promises from the colonel, which once seemed clear as day, began to fade like mist in the morning sun. He spoke less about paying me what I was owed and more about new improvements for the farm. New equipment, new lands, new projects, but always without fail the same excuse: we don't have the money right now, but it will come soon. I accepted it, like someone accepting a bitter medicine thinking the cure would come later. But time went on and I was left with no answers. The other workers began to question. Some started speaking among themselves, whispering about what they thought was happening. But I didn't want to listen. I still had faith because I believed that if the colonel were a man of his word, he would fulfill what he promised. It couldn't be possible that he was so different from everything I had been told I deserved. He treated me well, seemed to respect me, gave me attention. And that, in my mind, should have been enough. Until one day, one of the conversations between the other workers reached my ears. They were talking about the colonel and how he had, in fact, manipulated all of us. They spoke in low tones, but the words sank into my chest. I heard, without wanting to, that the colonel never intended to pay us, not truly. That the idea of helping the former slaves was a facade to keep us working without giving anything in return. The revelation hit me like a punch in the stomach, but in that moment, there was still a part of me that didn't want to believe it. I didn't know what to do with that information. My body wanted to deny it, but my heart, it was already preparing for the pain. I tried to speak to the colonel, demanding to understand what was going on. He received me as always with a smile and kind words, but something was different. I couldn't look at him the same way anymore. Something had broken inside me. And in that moment, I knew the truth was right there, right in front of my eyes, but the fear of facing it kept me silent. I still didn't know what to do, but I knew that somehow, the freedom I had longed for would not come from the colonel. True freedom was in knowing the truth and acting on it, no matter how painful it was. Deep down, I realized the colonel never wanted to be the man who would set me free. He just wanted to be the man who would imprison me in another way. The days after that conversation with the other workers felt like a storm was brewing inside me. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I had believed was a lie. The colonel's face, once a symbol of hope and guidance, now seemed to carry a mask of indifference. But still, I couldn't bring myself to confront him openly. There was a strange pull in my chest, an invisible thread that kept me tethered to this man, to this place. Maybe it was the years of conditioning, the need to believe in something greater than myself, something that promised security, even if it came in the form of lies. I told myself that I had to give it more time, that the reward would eventually come, just as he had said. The months passed and I kept working, pushing myself harder every day. But with each passing day, my body grew more weary, and the hope that had once burned so brightly began to flicker and dim. I watched as the other workers, those who had once shared my optimism, began to show signs of disillusionment. They stopped speaking with the same vigor, and the smiles that once greeted me every morning had turned into tired, resigned expressions. Some of them started leaving, quietly slipping away in the dead of night, their hopes extinguished. I tried to stay strong, telling myself that their leaving was a sign of weakness, that they couldn't see the bigger picture like I could. But deep down, I was beginning to feel the weight of their absence. The reality of the situation began to settle in, a quiet ache in my chest that only grew as time went on. The colonel had promised that the work we were doing would bear fruit, but all I could see was barren land and empty promises. I had become a prisoner in my own mind, shackled by the hope that had been planted so carefully in me. The more I worked, the more I wondered if this was the life I was meant to lead, endless toil with no end in sight. Then one evening, after another long day in the fields, the colonel approached me. He was smiling as he always did, but this time, there was something different in his demeanor. It was almost as if he could sense the doubts that had begun to take root in me, though he never spoke of them. He asked me to come with him to the far end of the farm, where he had started a new project. It was a small patch of land, barely noticeable to the eye, but something about it piqued my curiosity. He said it was a special project, one that would change everything. I followed him, hoping that this time, I would finally see the fruits of my labor, that this small patch of earth would be the key to everything he had promised. As we walked, he spoke of how the farm would grow, how it would become a model of success, a beacon of prosperity. But there was something unsettling about the way he spoke. It wasn't the passion I had once heard in his voice, but a cold certainty, as though he were speaking about something that had already been decided. I felt a chill run through me as I listened, my mind racing with questions that I couldn't yet bring myself to voice. When we reached the land, he handed me a shovel and gestured for me to begin digging. I did as he asked, though my heart wasn't in it. The soil was dry and hard, nothing like the rich earth we had worked with before. As I dug, I felt a strange sensation, as if the land itself was resisting my touch, as if it knew that no matter how much I worked, nothing would grow here. I glanced up at the colonel, hoping for some sign that he saw what I saw, but his face remained unchanged, his eyes fixed on the horizon. It was then that I realized the truth I had been trying so hard to deny. The fruit of our labor would never come. The farm, this land, it was all just a facade, a means to keep us working, to keep us believing in something that didn't exist. The colonel had never intended for us to prosper. He had used our hope as a tool to control us, to keep us bound to his will, just as the chains had once bound our bodies. I wanted to scream, to confront him, to demand the truth. But I couldn't. The words caught in my throat as if they too were bound by some invisible force. Instead, I dug deeper into the soil, my hands raw and bleeding, not from the labor, but from the realization that the life I had hoped for was nothing more than a cruel mirage. The next few days passed in a haze. I barely spoke to anyone, keeping to myself as the weight of what I had learned settled into my bones. I watched the other workers, their faces filled with the same quiet resignation I had seen in the others before them. Some of them had already begun to leave, disappearing into the night without a word. I couldn't blame them. The truth was impossible to ignore now. The colonel had lied to us all, using our dreams to fuel his own greed. But there was something in me that refused to give up completely. A small, stubborn part of me still clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this. I couldn't let myself be a slave again, even if it was in a different form. I would find a way to escape the colonel's grip, to reclaim what was mine, to break free from the chains that had once held my body and now held my spirit. And so, I made a decision. I would no longer be a part of this charade. I didn't know how or when, but I would leave. I would find my own way, even if it meant walking alone. The days passed slowly after that conversation. I couldn't help but feel a growing unease in my chest, as though the very ground beneath me was shifting, just waiting to swallow me whole. The colonel, once so kind and reassuring, had begun to feel like a distant shadow, his promises no longer echoing with the same certainty. The work continued, relentless, day after day, but now, every step I took on that farm felt heavier, like I was trudging through a fog of lies that I couldn't escape. It was on a quiet afternoon, after hours of laboring in the fields, that I noticed something strange. I overheard the colonel speaking to one of the overseers, his voice low and urgent. I couldn't make out all the words, but I caught enough to make my blood run cold. The colonel was talking about keeping the workers in line, and about how they needed to learn their place. His words were cold, calculating, and harsh in a way I hadn't heard before. It was as if the man I had trusted, the man who had once promised me a future, had become someone else entirely. I stayed hidden in the shadow of the barn, my heart pounding in my chest. The more I heard, the more I understood. The colonel was never planning to pay us. He wasn't trying to build something for us. All his talk of prosperity, of hard work being rewarded, those were just words, meant to keep us in line, to keep us working for nothing. I felt the bitter taste of betrayal settle in my mouth, a feeling I had known before, a feeling I had hoped I would never feel again. For the first time since I had arrived, I felt the urge to leave. I wanted to run, to escape from this man who had promised me everything and delivered nothing. But I couldn't. The fear of what lay beyond the farm, the unknown, held me in place. How could I leave? Where would I go? Would I even survive on my own? These were the questions that chained me, even as I realized that I was no more free than I had been before. I spent the following days in silence, my heart heavy, my hands working mechanically as though they no longer belonged to me. The other workers seemed oblivious, still following the same routine, still clinging to the same lies. And yet, there was something different about them, too. They had grown quieter, their faces more worn, their eyes dull. They, too, had begun to feel the weight of the truth pressing down on them. I wanted to speak to them, to share what I had overheard, but a part of me still clung to that faint hope, the hope that maybe, just maybe, the colonel would come through. Perhaps it was the memory of my past, the years of servitude and silence, that held me back. I had been taught not to question, not to speak up. But I could feel that quiet rebellion stirring inside me, a spark that hadn't been there before. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, I approached one of the older men who worked alongside me. He had been here longer than I had, and his eyes had seen more than mine ever would. He had worked under other men and now under the colonel. I thought he might understand, might give me some guidance, some sign that I wasn't alone in my thoughts. But when I spoke to him, his response was not what I expected. He looked at me, his face grim, and said only, "You should have known better. This man doesn't care for you. He never did." His words hit me harder than any blow. I wanted to deny them, to say that he was wrong, but deep down I knew he was right. The truth had always been there, hiding behind the colonel's sweet words, and now I could see it clearly. I didn't say anything more to him. What was there left to say? The truth was undeniable. The colonel had deceived me, had used my hope against me. I felt the last remnants of my trust in him crumble away, leaving nothing but the bitter reality of what I had become. A man trapped, not by chains of iron, but by the chains of my own beliefs, my own desperate need to believe in something better. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout at the sky, to demand answers. But instead, I kept quiet, my heart heavy with the weight of a truth I didn't know how to face. The colonel had kept his promises for as long as it suited him, but now I saw the lies for what they were, empty words designed to keep us working, to keep us docile. I knew then that I had been a fool. But there was no turning back. The feeling of betrayal, of having been used, was like a wound that wouldn't heal. And yet, somehow, I knew I had to carry it. I couldn't just walk away from everything I had known. I had to figure out what came next, how to survive in a world where nothing was what it seemed. I thought of the other workers. Some were too lost in their own struggles to see the truth. Others, like me, were beginning to wake up, but they didn't know how to escape. It wasn't just about leaving the farm, it was about breaking free from the lies we had all been fed, lies that had kept us bound in a new kind of slavery. The hardest part wasn't seeing the truth, it was knowing what to do with it. If you've ever been stuck, fooled, or lost, maybe you understand. Maybe you've had your own struggles, your own journey. If you've made it this far, then you know, we can't keep letting ourselves be misled. Subscribe, stay with me for the truth. The days stretched on, each one blending into the next like the monotonous rhythm of a life that had long since lost its meaning. I continued working, my hands moving on their own, but my mind was elsewhere, drifting like a leaf caught in a wind that had no direction. The truth of what I had learned about the colonel gnawed at me constantly, but I still didn't know what to do with it. I felt trapped in a prison built by my own belief, by the lie that freedom was something someone else could give me. The workers around me seemed to sense the change too, but no one spoke of it openly. Perhaps they were too afraid, too beaten down by years of false hope to even acknowledge the truth when it was staring them in the face. Or maybe they had given up, resigned to the fact that this was all there was now, this endless cycle of work with no reward, no future. I spent my nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling of the small room the colonel had given me. The air felt thick with the weight of my thoughts. The question that had been growing in me for weeks was no longer something I could ignore. What now? What was the point of continuing this charade? I had fought so hard for a chance at freedom, only to find that the chains had simply taken a different form. The colonel had promised me a life of dignity, of purpose. But the more I worked, the more I realized that my labor was just a means to an end for him. He didn't care about my well-being, about my future. He only cared about maintaining control, about keeping us working without ever questioning him. The longer I stayed, the more I felt the walls closing in around me. I could almost hear the echoes of the past, the chains of slavery that once held me, reminding me that I had to keep fighting. I began to talk to the others again, though this time it was different. I could see the same weariness in their eyes that I felt in my own heart. We all knew something was wrong, but no one seemed to have the strength to speak out, to take action. It was as if we were all waiting for someone else to make the first move, to break the silence that had kept us in check for so long. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, I found myself alone in the field where I had first worked with the colonel. I had come to a decision. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep working for someone who would never fulfill his promises. The idea of leaving was terrifying, but it had become the only option. I stood there for a long time, looking out at the land that I had hoped would be the beginning of something new. It was empty, barren, just like the promises the Colonel had made. And in that emptiness, I found the strength to make my decision. I would leave. I didn't know where I would go or what I would do, but I knew I couldn't stay. I couldn't be part of this lie any longer. But even as I made the decision to leave, something in me hesitated. The Colonel had been a father figure, a man who had offered me a chance when no one else would. How could I turn my back on him after all he had done for me? But then the truth came crashing down on me once more. He had never truly helped me. He had used me. And in using me, he had broken something inside me that I would never get back. I realized that the hardest part of leaving wasn't the fear of the unknown, or the struggle to survive on my own. The hardest part was accepting that the person I had trusted, the man I had believed in, was no better than the people who had enslaved me. And that realization hurt more than anything else. I spent the rest of the night thinking, weighing my options, but the decision was already made. I had no other choice. I couldn't keep living a lie, no matter how comfortable or familiar it felt. It was time to break free, even if it meant walking away from everything I had known. In the morning, I packed up my things. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even the workers I had come to know. It felt wrong to say goodbye, but in my heart, I knew I had to go. I couldn't stay another day under the weight of false hope. I couldn't stay and watch the Colonel continue to manipulate us all. As I walked away from the farm, I didn't know what the future would hold. I didn't know where I would go or how I would survive. But for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of something inside me. It wasn't hope, not yet. But it was the first step toward something better, something real. And that, I realized, was all I needed. Leaving was the hardest thing I've ever done. The fear of the unknown gnawed at my insides, but I knew that if I stayed, I'd lose myself completely. The farm, the Colonel, they were chains now, chains that no longer had any visible form, but were there all the same, tightening around me with every passing day. I couldn't breathe anymore, not under his control, not in the shadow of his empty promises. I walked away slowly at first, as if I were testing the very air outside the farm. My legs felt heavy, like they had been bound in the soil that had become my prison for so long. But with each step, that heaviness lessened. The world outside the farm was strange to me now, unfamiliar, but it was freedom. Or at least, the possibility of it. It felt like stepping into a new chapter, one that was still blank, still unwritten, full of possibilities. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting the Colonel to come riding after me, shouting, demanding I return. Maybe I expected it because I had always been taught that running away wasn't an option, that there would always be someone chasing you, someone who would make you pay for daring to leave. But no one followed. No one came after me. It was as if I had never mattered to anyone except myself. I walked for hours until the night began to fall. I found a small patch of woods and lay there trying to sleep, but the thoughts swirled in my mind like a storm. I thought of the men and women still on the farm, still toiling in the dirt for a man who never cared about them. Would they ever realize the truth? Would they ever wake up the way I had? I didn't know, but I hoped. I prayed that someone else would see what I had seen, that they would find the courage to leave too, to take the first step toward their own freedom. The next morning, I woke with the sun, my body sore and stiff from the night on the cold ground, but my heart was lighter. For the first time in so long, I felt the weight of the chains I had carried for years begin to lift. I wasn't free yet. There was still so much to be done, so much to figure out. I didn't even know where I would go next, but I knew that I couldn't turn back. There was no turning back. I began to walk again with no destination in mind, just moving. I passed through small villages, saw people working in fields, carrying on with their daily lives. It struck me how different life was now. People were moving forward with their lives, with their families, their own sense of purpose, while I was still trying to find my own. I didn't have anyone with me, no family, no friends. I was alone in a world that had moved on without me. It was hard to accept at first, the fact that I had no place, no home, nothing but my own will to survive. But as I kept walking, I realized something. The journey I had started wasn't just about escaping the farm or the Colonel. It wasn't just about leaving behind the lies and the empty promises. It was about reclaiming myself, my dignity, my right to decide what my life would be. It was about finding my own place in a world that I had been kept from for so long. And though the road ahead seemed uncertain, I knew that I would find my way. I had to. I spent the next few weeks moving from town to town, working odd jobs to survive. I didn't care what kind of work it was, anything to keep moving, anything to keep my mind occupied. But with each day, I found a new strength I hadn't known I had. I learned to trust myself again, to believe that I was capable of more than just surviving. The freedom I had once dreamed of was no longer a far-off ideal. It was right in front of me, and every small decision I made was a step toward making that freedom real. As the months passed, I found myself in a small town by the river. It wasn't much, but it was peaceful. I found work in a small shop, sweeping the floors and helping with deliveries. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and for the first time I felt like I had a place where I could rebuild. I had nothing but the clothes on my back, but I had something far more valuable: my dignity. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I never forgot the Colonel. I never forgot the farm, the promises, or the lies. But as time went on, I realized that they were no longer a part of me. They were memories now, painful memories, but memories that no longer held any power over me. I had freed myself not just from the Colonel, but from the chains of my own fear, my own doubts. Looking back, I can't help but wonder if I would have ever found the courage to leave if I hadn't seen the truth. If I hadn't faced the lies head-on, would I still be stuck, working day after day, believing in something that would never be? I don't know. But I do know this: the moment I decided to leave, I also decided to live. To live on my own terms, to make my own choices, and to never let anyone control me again. It's strange, isn't it? How a man can live his entire life believing that he's trapped, that he has no choice but to keep moving forward, no matter how hard or empty the road is. And then one day he wakes up and realizes that the road was never close to him. It was only his own fear that kept him from stepping off the path he was on. That's how I felt the moment I settled into the small town by the river. It wasn't grand, it wasn't the life I had once dreamed of, but it was mine. I was free, and I was starting to believe that freedom meant more than just the absence of chains. The people in that town were kind, simple folk who didn't ask many questions. They saw me for what I was, a man who had come from somewhere else, with a past he didn't speak about. They didn't need to know my story. I didn't need to tell them. What mattered was that I was there, working alongside them, earning my keep, slowly but surely building something from nothing. The work was hard, but it was honest, and it felt good to feel tired at the end of the day. At first, I was just a worker, one of many who came and went. But something changed in me. I started to feel a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about living, about being present in the moment, and about owning the decisions I made. I remember the first time I was paid in that town. It wasn't much, just enough to keep food on the table and a roof over my head, but it was mine. The money wasn't a gift, it wasn't a handout. It was the result of my own labor, of my own effort. That small sum of money felt like a mountain to me. It wasn't the amount that mattered. It was the fact that I had earned it with my own hands, without anyone controlling me, without anyone's lies hanging over my head. The simple pleasures of life became my treasures. The smell of the earth after a rainstorm. The sound of the river flowing just outside my door. The warmth of the fire at night, crackling as I sat in silence, listening to the night sounds of the town. These were things I had never fully appreciated before, because I had always been too busy chasing a future that wasn't real. I met people in that town, not many but a few, who became my friends, people who understood the value of a hard day's work. They didn't know the details of my past, and I didn't need to tell them. But they respected me, and that was something I hadn't felt in so long. I was just Joao, a man trying to make a living, no different from anyone else. For the first time, I felt like I was part of something that didn't require me to be anything other than who I was. As the seasons changed, I started to feel something shift inside me. I had spent so many years living with the weight of my past, so many years clinging to the hope of something better, that I had forgotten what it meant to simply be. To live without the fear of being controlled, without the anxiety of wondering when the next betrayal would come. For the first time in my life, I was free to make my own choices, to decide my own fate. There were days, of course, when the past would come back to haunt me. Memories of the farm, of the colonel's promises, of the weight of the chains. Those thoughts would sometimes creep in when I was alone at night. But they didn't control me anymore. I had learned to let them pass like the clouds in the sky. They were a part of me, yes, but they didn't define me. The man I was becoming now was someone who could live, who could choose to move forward, even when the past tried to pull him back. One evening, as I sat by the river, watching the water flow steadily by, I realized that the journey I had been on was not just about escaping the colonel or the farm. It was about reclaiming my own life, my own power. I had spent so many years being told what to do, where to go, how to think. But now, in this small town, I could think for myself. I could choose to be who I wanted to be. And that, I realized, was the truest form of freedom. I had walked away from a life of lies, of manipulation, of false promises. I had escaped from a man who had used my hope as a tool to control me. But in doing so, I had found something far more valuable than any dream of a better life. I had found the strength to live my truth, to be who I was meant to be without anyone telling me who I should be. As the months went on, I began to feel something that had long been absent from my heart: hope. Not the kind of hope that relies on the promises of others, but the kind that comes from within, from knowing that I am capable of creating my own future. That hope was quiet, like the river that flowed beside me, steady and constant. And for the first time in my life, I believed in it. I believed in myself. There were mornings in the early light when I still couldn't believe I was free. The air felt different, lighter. The days were mine now, each one stretching out before me, not as a burden but as a chance to make something of my own. In the small town by the river, I found peace, a peace I had never known in my years of service and struggle. The world had become less frightening, less uncertain. I was no longer running. I wasn't trying to escape anymore. I had arrived at something that felt like home. I spent the mornings by the river watching it flow endlessly as it had for centuries. It was as if it understood what I was going through, how hard it was to let go of the past, how difficult it was to leave behind all the pain and the scars that came with it. But the river never stopped moving. It kept flowing no matter what. And somehow it gave me the strength to do the same. To keep moving. To keep breathing. I often think about the men and women I left behind on the farm. The ones still bound to the colonel's lies, the ones who still hope for a better life, though they don't realize that the better life is not in his promises but in their own hands. I wonder if they'll ever know what it feels like to truly be free, to feel like the future is something they can control. But then I remind myself that I can't carry their burdens too. I've done what I could. I've taken the first step. Now it's their turn to find their way. I've been free now for many years. Feels strange to say that. To say that I am no longer a prisoner to the chains that once held me, no longer a prisoner to the past that sought to define me. But I know it hasn't been easy. It's been a journey, one that's far from over. There are still days when the memories creep back in, when I remember the pain, the betrayals, the weight of those years. And I still feel the anger, the frustration, the sorrow of what was lost. But I also know that I've come farther than I ever thought I could. And in that, there is a quiet strength that I've found within myself. I've learned that freedom isn't something you just wake up with one day. It's something you earn day by day in the small choices you make, in the way you choose to live, in the way you choose to move forward. It's a journey that never truly ends, but it's one that's worth taking. As I stand here at the edge of the river, watching the water move with a purpose I now understand, I realize that my story doesn't have a neat ending. There are no happy endings, no final conclusions. There are only moments, small, fleeting moments, that make up the whole of our lives. And all I can do is keep moving, keep living, and keep remembering that I have the power to choose my path, even when the road ahead is unclear. So, if you're still here, still listening to my story, know this: the road is hard, but it's worth walking. And if you find yourself lost, if you find yourself in the dark, remember, you're not alone. We're all just trying to find our way step by step, just like I did. If you've made it this far, I ask you, stay with me, stay with those who have walked this road too. Subscribe, keep listening, and let's continue on this journey together.